Bonsoir à tous. Hello, everyone. My name is Claire Bourgeois. I'm the director at Schiller International University in Paris, and I'm very happy to welcome you tonight for our Schiller Talk. We are welcoming tonight one of our professors, Xiaoyu Li, who joined Schiller in 2014 and is the adjunct professor and program lead of Bachelor in International Business at Schiller International University in Paris. She's been teaching for a few years now, since 2014, mainly human resources management and cross-cultural communication. She has been an active professional and a great learner in HR management, business development, quantitative finance, and environmental, social, and corporate governance investment across 3 continents. After selling her consulting firm in 2011, Xiaoyu left the US, came to France to fully undertake missions of cross-border delegation in workforce management between North America and Europe. Tonight, we are ready with Xiaoyu Li to listen to some provocative thought on diversity management. Is it more than a marketing tool for companies? Is it really a strategic business growth enabler? Is it really based on talent? All these topics and more will be discussed with Xiaoyu Li in a discussion, and you will be able to share your questions in the chat in the platforms, and your questions will be shared at the end of the presentation. So feel free to write them in the chat online. And now, please, Xiaoyu, it's your turn.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Claire, for inviting me to today's talk, subject that has always been very dear to my heart. I think it's a very audacious initiative for both Schiller and myself to discuss controversy around diversity. For Schiller, because you're basically putting yourself under the scrutiny of your audience, right? Coca-Cola would probably not invite an expert to talk about diabetes. So for myself, it's because I'll basically shoot myself in the foot as a former consultant in this field with all the contradiction I'm going to share with you today. So what is a contradiction? I don't think you need to be a professional in diversity management to notice how this industry is prospering. Just think about the amount of buzzwords you hear on books, magazines, news coverage, advertisement, and all the trainings that you are proposed to inside your own organizations, right? So in 2019, there was this very interesting book titled Diversity Inc., The Failed Promise of a Billion-Dollar Business by journalist and Professor Pamela Newkirk. And in the book, she cited the research of an MIT professor who found that companies, they spend estimate $8 billion every year on diversity efforts. Now, given that was in 2003, so for this lecture, I double checked on the latest figure, and what I got is $16 billion in 2019. So that is between 2003 to 2019, we doubled in figures for this business. And most of the Fortune 500 firms nowadays have mandated bias reduction trainings. And this demand has really exploded in recent years. So once again, I quote from this book. In 2019, you have a survey which found that among the 234 companies in the S&P 500 companies, 63% of the diversity professionals were appointed or promoted to their roles during the last 3 years, right? So that's great. The industry is booming, right? So shouldn't this be good news? All right, let's just think about this for 1 second. If you are in the profession of, let's say, medical care, and suddenly there is a huge wave of recruitment in your industry, would you consider that as good news? Or maybe you think that we're in a pandemic, right? So having a booming industry itself isn't very much, for me, a reliable marker that we're making any progress. And we really need to get down to a closer examination of the result of our efforts. So how well did we do with all this money and human capital that we put into this cause? All these consultants, me myself included, right? Did our efforts really bear fruit? That is when I decided to take a nosedive into my research and basically just let my jaw drop with all the findings that I'll be sharing with you today, from both industry surveys and academic researches. So according to the professor I cited before, report from consulting firm Russell and Reynolds Associate has shown that more than half of the diversity professionals do not have resources or support needed to execute their programs, and only 35% had access to companies' demographic metrics. And in a survey of more than 1,800 company executives, they found that diversity ranked last of the 8 potential business priorities. And to be honest, this is completely in line with my very own experience from many encounters I had with these business executives. Very often during our encounter, I can see these sparkles in their eyes. And very often, it's not really enthusiasm that they feel for the cause, but really this eagerness to get it over with, right? Later, I will be sharing more stories on this very problem. So this is feedback we get from the battlefield. Now, what about academic researches? Do we have more, let's say, scientific studies on the industry? Yes, we do. In 2016, there are 2 professors. They came up with this very intriguing paper where they spent 3 years studying 800 US firms. And the paper is called Why Diversity Programs Fail. And the result is, I cite, strategies for controlling bias, which drives most diversity efforts, have failed spectacularly. Some even backfire. For example, resulting in anger, resentment, and adverse impact on the disadvantaged group. Okay, later we will get into details as for why this happened. But across board, you have many other researchers that raise a similar kind of concern. Now, that being said, there is this great discrepancy between the prosperity of the phenomenon of diversity management and its true efficacy. So what happened? My topic today is diversity management a beautiful lie? Now, I want you to first ask yourself, if your answer is yes, you probably have this flame inside your heart, right? A cry that is unheard by the justice. If that's the case, I would say keep that anger, keep that flame alive, because that's often how things get moved forward. But my answer to the question is no. I do not think diversity management is a lie. Why? Because to accuse somebody of lying is basically to say that the person is intentionally manipulating the truth. The failure of most diversity programs is not a question of intention. There's no solid proof to back up such a bold statement. In fact, most people, from my own observation, have good faith when we go about the diversity initiatives, but still many fail. So if it's not an intention problem, what is it, right? And that's what we're going to try to figure out together today. I will be proposing 4 points that account for our failure based on empirical studies mainly, right? And at the end of the speech, I will be more than happy to answer your questions and discuss with you any comments you have. Okay, so to understand the first element, which is what I call the fire distinguisher culture or forensic culture, we have to go back to the history of diversity management for a second, because it will shed some light on a good portion of the problem. Now, nowadays, when we talk about diversity, we incorporate many notions, right? Typically, we think about racial issues, gender, sexual orientation, political beliefs, etc., etc. But the root of diversity management, it really came from the racial conflicts that was deeply embedded in our human history. Here I say human, it's not an American issue only. although, of course, the problem has some of its most outrageous manifestation in the United States. Okay, so in 1950, we abolished the Jim Crow law in the United States, which basically ended the segregation period. However, what it did not end is the inequality problem. So later, with the civil rights movement in 1960s, we introduced the famous, or for certain people, infamous AAP program, Affirmative Action Program, right? Although this program has greatly contributed to granting the underrepresented population better access to work, to educational problems, it has also brought lots of backlash, and the most noticeable being reverse discrimination. So there's this constant debate of its true virtue. For the moment, if my memory is correct, 10 states in the United States have banned the program and replaced it with other initiatives, so to speak. So historically, diversity program aiming at implementing AAP, affirmative action, is very much compliance oriented. What does that mean? Is that the story is often interpreted as fitting in quota. Okay, by quota, I mean, for instance, a certain percentage of the enrollment at school is allocated to a certain ethnic background. Okay, a certain percent of job has to be filled by men or women or minority groups. All right, so it's about fitting in quotas. It's about making sure that rules are respected, because otherwise there will be lawsuit, or at least some sort of judicial scrutiny, right? And when it triggers reverse discrimination, very often it's court meeting again. Okay, so sometimes the twists and turns associated with the AAP program can take some really surprising route. There was this book called Bad Feminist. I read it a couple of years ago. It's written by Roxane Gay, a writer and professor of black skin color. So in the book, there's this story that she always remembered. When she was enrolled into her PhD program, there were 14 students in her class. And one day, when she was in the corridor, she overheard the conversation of the other students inside the classroom. She was the only person of color in that class. Remember this, okay? So the conversation went like this. Someone said, you know what? We got an affirmative action student in this class, according to the quota. So guess who that could be, right? Roxane, being the only person of color, whatever competence she had was not what got she where she was in the eyes of these other people, despite the very fact that she was a student with the highest GPA score in that very pool of candidates for the program. Okay, so needless to say, despite the many merits of the program, there's always controversy and litigation around it. Okay, so that's AAP. Then in 1990s, we started to have some really high-profile class action lawsuit against some of the biggest corporations of the United States. The most notorious one being the case against Texaco and Coca-Cola, one in 1996, another one in 1990. Okay, Texaco eventually had to pay $172 million. Coca-Cola, $193 million, and that is still to this day the largest corporate racial discrimination class action lawsuit. Okay, so let's talk about these two cases for a second. We'll be able to understand why, more than anything else, it's the fear of litigation that really gave diversity management this momentum. Okay, let's start with Texaco. In 1994, there were 6 very qualified African American employees. They filed a class action complaint against Texaco. The claim was the company failed to promote African Americans, and they failed to compensate them fairly in relation to the Caucasian employees of the similar jobs. Okay, now, so far, this sounds like a classic case of racial discrimination. So what made it such a big deal later? What happened was, during the investigation by the lawyer that was hired by the plaintiff, Mr. Mary. One day, Mr. Mary received a secret package from a formerly fired HRD. And inside the package, there was a tape which recorded the conversation of tax code executives. And you can hear clearly from the tape, there was the treasurer of the company. He was complaining about the diversity programs by using wording such as the black jelly bean and the N-word. And later, this very tape was broadcast in ABC News. Okay, so sort of like a Watergate scandal, but in workforce management. Okay, so of course, right after that, you have immediate public response to these tapes, and the verdict was announced very, very soon after. And that was considered back then the largest lawsuit in terms of the amount the company has to pay for the settlement. However, right after that, Coca-Cola followed suit. And the allegation against Coca-Cola is very similar with that of tax code, but the reaction of the company was really lamentable. It basically made all the possible mistakes, okay, the denial of their malpractice, the refusal to address issues until it's way too late. During the period of the litigation, there was even a change of CEO, who unfortunately did not assume the company's responsibility. So, several people's complaints eventually became a national headline. I remember you had strike, you had justice right, and you had nation-level manifestation. Okay, there were lots of documents reporting it. So eventually, Coca-Cola cleared up the mess. They engaged new CEO, new diversity managers, and very important, a task force, which even included the lawyer who worked for the plaintiffs, Mr. Mary, as mentioned before. In fact, many of the best practices in contemporary diversity management actually came from Coca-Cola. But to get to where they are today, they have paid a very, very hefty fee. So then, along with Coke, you have a series of litigation against Wall Street, such as Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, etc., etc. And if you look at the timeline of these high-profile lawsuits, you will find that it's almost at exactly same time you have the surge of demand for diversity management service. Since 2000, 99% of Fortune 500 companies have paid settlement in at least one discrimination or sexual harassment lawsuit. And you have complaints that are not necessarily Fortune 500, but still quite high profile. Off the top of my mind, Airbnb, Uber, for instance. Okay. Now, that being said, the fear of litigation is a major motive for many companies to put in place diversity initiative in the first place. That in itself is not a problem, in the sense that if you have a legal problem, you want to do everything to mend the issue. Okay. However, this could be a problem in the sense that if you use this spirit to guide the way you conduct your program, that is to say, if the leading spirit for you is to be compliant, then you get into this what I call fire distinguisher culture or forensic culture, because you will only be handling the problems when there's fire or a cadaver, right? So your understanding of the problem and the way you solve it are extremely limited. Typically, say that your goal is not get yourself into legal trouble. Then very often, the way you create your training content is to use mainly negative reinforcement, which features legal settlement and threats. So you have this very command and control policy with this antithesis mentality. You put on the one side, we, and then on the other side, they. We being whatever dominant group you have, and they being the people that you want to be careful around, right? You've heard about this. Now, just listen to some of these answers people have to the question, what have you learned from these training sessions? Quote number 1, white males are mighty and evil. Quote number 2, women and people of color are sensitive creatures. Quote number 3, the freedom of speech is impossible at workplace. Okay, you got the drift. So there's next to zero real understanding of diversities here. because all you're doing is to project this jungle image, right? Where different species have to be very much on the alert all the time. Of course, instead of solving the problem, you would create more tension. So once again, from that very paper I cited early, Why Diversity Programs Fail, the authors show that the result of this type of training, that is to say mainly compliance-oriented, they often have the very opposite result to what one would desire. So for instance, often white males feel resentment and anger because they feel like the training program is about shaming them. And given that lots of these cases are based on legal threat, they run counter with human nature. So the more you try to repress, the more rebellion you get, the more hostility you harvest, right? So in the end, a good number of these compliance-based training programs, they result in adverse impact on the very people that they are designed to help and to protect. The paper have found that typically after this type of program, the number of Black women in management will drop by 9%. The number of Asian men and women will drop by 4% and 3% respectively. And to make the case worse, unless you have a very sound analysis of the data, you might be thinking that you're doing a pretty good job. Why so? Now, in 2015, there were 1,900 discrimination complaints made to EEOC. Now, EEOC, that's Equal Employment Opportunity Committee. That's a major body in charge of these complaints in the United States. So in 2015, you have 1,900 complaints made to EEOC. Okay, and if you dig into the numbers, you will find that 45% are charges of retaliation. What does that mean? That means managers will report wrongdoings, but instead of having these problems solved, the victim, they suffer from retaliation. So later, for fear of further retaliation, victims, they tend to report less complaints, right? So management might think, well, we're doing a much better job now. See the dilemma here. So what is the solution? The same study have also shown that we are better off without certain mandatory type of training, especially the one where we single out people to get retrained on compliance because they've made certain mistakes. Because this would often give them this feeling of being shamed, as a culprit, as a criminal, right? So instead, what works better is when we have voluntary involvement of the management. So for instance, instead of imposing them on, let's say, hours of mandatory lecture-based trainings, we ask them to come up with plans for, say, campus recruitment campaign on a voluntary basis. Now, the beauty of this kind of initiative is that it capitalizes on this idea of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance, what is this? It's this discomfort that we all experience, okay, when we have an idea that is not compatible with what we are used to. And when that happens, when the cognitive dissonance happens, we tend to either change our belief or behavior, or we seek out new information that can help to outweigh our dissonance. Okay, so for instance, if you do not believe in capital punishment, but you are asked to write an essay to defend it, then what often happens is that your effort to seek out new information, this really would help you to reduce your cognitive dissonance, and you tend to have a deeper understanding and a more clement attitude towards this problem. So in the case of our discussion here, when the manager with bias is actively involved in seeking solutions for diversity recruitment, he or she is put into a place to confront his or her very discomfort, right? Therefore, there's a great chance of changes in either his or her belief or behavior or both. Okay? All right, another problem associated with this historical residue is that many people, managers especially, do not really understand what we are talking about when we're talking about diversity. It's not them to blame, right? Because even among academia, we do not have a consensus on this very problem. but we do have to address issue. You cannot fix a problem without knowing what the problem is. So for instance, in higher education industry, right, my very industry, a field that is supposed to be full of enlightened people, that is on the very forefront of studying diversity initiatives, right? Study have found that among the 771 chief diversity officers in the chosen higher education institution, 10% of them cannot have a common definition of diversity. Now, further speech, during my very own research, I myself is very often confused with all these different readings that came into my vision. Okay, so generally speaking, in business, if you ask people, why do we promote diversity? There are typically 3 reasons. Okay, number 1, as I mentioned before, the fear for litigation. Number 2, more in line with the business. Okay, that's to say, because we would like to expand business to a certain segmentation of population. Makes sense. Then you have a 3rd reason, which is becoming more and more popular. At least more and more people are voicing in such fashion. They say that because diversity helps to bring in new ideas, it helps boost productivity, raises morale, this and that. Okay, now each of these 3 arguments, 3 beliefs, they make sense. But each of them has a great blind spot, and none of them offers a very comprehensive reading into the notion of diversity. Now, the first one, only about avoiding lawsuit. So you get into the mentality of policing and you create more rebellion, as we discussed before. And the second one, to align with your business strategy, especially to attract consumers of a targeted population, right? What's wrong with it? Now, if you stick to this understanding, you would typically pigeonhole people, and this would reflect it in your staffing, because you would only view people of a certain background as a way for you to open up a certain market, instead of viewing them as a myriad of different things, as any complete human beings. So this would often result in the feeling of being exploited by these very employees, and eventually you lose very valuable human capital. What is interesting is, this does not only happen when you recruit people with certain characteristics to deal with very specific population. You notice this also on expatriates. What we often witness is that this happened during the period of re-expatriation. That's to say, when an expatriate comes to the end of his expatriation term, he comes back to his home country. What we often notice is, often when this person comes back to his home or her home country, there is no more suitable position for him in the organization. And their expertise at the host country are often not given any due attention, as if this kind of expertise can only be valued in this very specific region, right? So this vision, the vision of this type of company made it that they can only associate diversity with very specific market instead of being able to incorporate it at a corporate level, right? So that is the limit with the second mentality. Now, the third one, I think, is perhaps the trickiest one. That is to say, let's go for diversity because it boosts ideas, enhances productivities, raises morale, once again, this and that, okay? Now, what studies have shown is that what matters at the end of the day is not really about putting people together, because you do have companies with rather homogeneous population, and they do better than companies with a seemingly more diverse workforce. What matters at the end of the day is that you have both the diversity and the capacity to capitalize on your diversity, aka your capacity to promote inclusion. Why? Because diversity does not equal inclusion. It does not equal a sense of belonging. Simply by putting people together does not really mean anything if you do not have this willingness to cooperate. Okay, so without this conscious effort to promote inclusion, you'll never truly benefit from diversity. And inclusion is more than the numbers of your recruitment. It's more than the number of your paycheck, the figure on your paycheck. It's more about experience. So it's very hard to measure. There are lots of value and behavioral-based elements into it. So for instance, the one easy yet very powerful indicator of your inclusion effort is the way you organize your meeting. Many of us use the product of Salesforce. Now, in Salesforce, they have a CEO, not the chief executive officer, but the chief equity officer. They have somebody in this role. His name is Tom Profit, and he explained how at Salesforce, they embrace meetings as a golden opportunity for them to implement these good inclusion practices. This is what he said. So when we have meetings, we make sure that meeting is not a time for consensus. Because otherwise, why bother discuss if you all agree with the same thing, right? So for us, meeting is a time that we have to guarantee there is the atmosphere to foster disagreement. And for disagreement to happen, we have to guarantee two things at least. One, we have diversity in our participants. And two, each person is absolutely given equal airtime so their voice can be truly heard. Okay. Now, recently, there is another study that has demonstrated something very interesting. That is, during the pandemic of COVID, there is a surge in women's presence in Zoom call meetings, as well as an increase in their willingness to voice. And the reason is rather simple, because with a Zoom call, you are no more limited by the physical size of your meeting room, and you tend to just give invitation to every stakeholder, right? So more women are invited to the meeting space, and the increase in presence has empowered more women to speak up. Also, the format of anonymous chatting, because sometimes you do not need to leave your own real name. So the anonymous chatting and message sometimes also encourage more people to express their opinions, right? So I found that extremely interesting. So some food for thought there, okay? So what are we really talking about when we're talking about diversity? It's actually inclusion. To acknowledge that what we have in common as human beings is that we're all different and we all crave belongings despite our difference. And the best building material of this foundation is through experience, because inclusion is experience-based. That's why some of the most efficient diversity initiatives include peer work, cross-training, self-managed teams, and mentoring, right? All experience-based. And another reason for why such commingle of people often work is because skin in the game, okay? The notion of skin in the game. When you put people to work for a common goal, be that teamwork or mentor-mentee relationship, everybody has something at stake for their common endeavor. Okay, so that's what I mean, skin in the game. So people tend to correct their own cognitive dissonance if there is any. Okay. Now, another best practice that stems from this rationale is that when we conduct cross-cultural trainings these days, especially for the future expatriates, we started to do things the other way around. So for instance, here in France, if I'm about to prepare a French national before his or her departure to, let's say, conduct business in Japan, so instead of teaching him or her the table manner in Japan, how Japanese are different when they eat noodle or drink soup because they make this noise, okay, we now teach the French nationals the French table manners first. Of course, they all understand table manners, but we teach them how, as a French person, he or she is taught since childhood to not make noise when they consume food. So the idea is to help the trainee to understand the root of the difference. It's not that the Japanese are different, it's that the French are also different, right? So I'm not different from you, but I'm different with you, okay? So with this, hopefully we're no more limited by the notion of diversity, and we can truly build this mental gymnastics to help us to process. Now, another very powerful tool I have recently learned that personally helped me to deepen my understanding of difference is the notion of ordinary privilege. This notion came from Professor Dolly Chuck. She is a professor at Stern Business School of New York University. And she recently wrote a book, a couple of years ago, I think, called The Good Person You Meant to Be, where she introduced the notion of ordinary privilege. So ordinary privilege are these things that we take for granted because we are born with it. So naturally, we benefit from it without asking any questions. Now, for instance, the author said that every morning when she wakes up, she carries with her this ordinary privilege of being heterosexual. Therefore, there are mental and physical space that she can easily enter without feeling threatened. I found this adoption of this idea extremely useful. For instance, me myself, as a person without kids, I have the ordinary privilege of being free of any stressors related to all child-caring activities, right? And the realization of this helped me tremendously to gain consideration for many people around me, especially my neighbor whose kids have been raising hell during the most difficult period of the lockdown period, right? And also during the pandemic, as a university, Schiller, we have opened our eyes to another ordinary privilege that we never really thought about before. That is the access to stable Wi-Fi connection. Due to the lockdown of Europe, at one point given, we had to move all courses online. And that's when we realized how some of our students do not have stable internet. So we were very sensitive and reactive to the issue. And quickly, we no more take it for granted that stable internet should be a prerequisite for taking courses. But it's an ordinary privilege, right? You do not really realize it until somebody raises a finger. So we made sure that accommodations were made for this contingency, right? So I found the understanding of this notion very useful, at least for us to enlarge the scope of difference. Okay, so that's basically my first point on why I think lots of diversity programs fail. The history of diversity management itself has left with us some very, very bad habits, and we have to expand our understanding of diversity. That is to say, to chuck some of these traditional tools and to embrace differences with the idea of inclusion. Now, my second argument as for why lots of diversity programs fail is the lack of scientific rigor. When I use the word scientific, I'm not saying that in order to be a qualified consultant, you have to be from academic background, right? If anything, I think that having your feet in both academic and professional world is extremely valuable. So you can have this firsthand experience, be that coming up with programs or testing it in real life. And here's a very funny statement from one of the chief equity officer at Coca-Cola, that was. And he said, lots of HR consultants in diversity are just academic bookworms and esoteric. They don't know anything about companies' budgets, politics, bureaucracy, but they're really good at marketing and making money, right? So you do have this reputation of academia not being in touch with real life, although it's only half truth, I can guarantee you that. But also, different from nature science, social science by nature has to evolve with the society. Okay, so I do admit many academic ideas should be evolving, almost like a living thing. Give you an example. One of the most influential ideas in cross-cultural communication studies is the cultural dimension theories from Professor Hofstede. Okay, y'all probably have heard about this. Now, one of these pillars that he uses is the notion of muscular culture versus feminine culture. Okay, you all heard about how Scandinavian countries being feminine, Japanese culture being muscular, etc. Okay, so for him, typically femininity is related to caring, collaboration, social welfare, whereas masculinity, performance-driven competition, traditional gender roles, etc. Now, the idea is no more proposed, okay, or at least modified in many textbooks nowadays. Why? Well, because of the pure fact of relating the notion of masculinity and femininity with such ideas is cliche in itself. And that is one of the most influential ideas we had, right? So What I say when I say scientific rigor is not about publishing a piece of paper or finding solutions uniquely from the papers. What I mean is to have a scientific way of conceiving programs and evaluating them. Now, there is a paper that I consider as one of the most comprehensive papers that studies the efficacy of lots of diversity initiatives. The paper is called Prejudice Reduction, What Works? And it was written by Professor Elizabeth Pellock from Harvard and Professor Donna Green from Yale. Now, these two authors, once again, gigantic efforts of work. They have spent a period of 5 years studying 893 published and unpublished reports on various interventions to reduce prejudice, to see what worked and what not. Just imagine the scale of the study. And what they found is the entire genre of prejudice reduction programs lacks serious scientific evaluation. Most of these things are not tested. Therefore, we have to remain skeptical. Right? Now, that's not to say the program do not work. But what is dangerous is that when things are popularized and you get on this bandwagon and you make it into a lucrative business without any real proof of efficacy, then it could be a problem because you do receive a paycheck for proposing these kind of problems, right? So you might be wasting somebody's time and money. Let me give you an example. Some of the most widely used programs based on behavioral science do not work as they promise. Simply do not. Sometimes it's because of the limitation of these studies themselves, and sometimes it's because of misusage of such studies. Okay, so many of you probably have heard or even participated in the implied bias training. Even if you have never participated in it, you probably have done this test called the implied association test, IAT. Okay, or you have seen people publishing their scores on Facebook or Twitter, revealing their embedded bias. So here's the story. IAT, implied association test. This is a self-employed association test. It's conceived by Harvard researchers. You can find it and test it yourself on it. The website is implicit.harvard.edu. Okay, so basically, it has a bunch of things that you can test yourself on in order to see if you have blind spots, unconscious bias. Typically, you are proposed these ideas, and you have to click very quickly words which you associate these ideas with. Okay, so often after test, you found that you have more tendency to associate black with bad, white with good, men with science, women with liberal arts, for example, right? So you're exposed to your own bias. Now, this test is widely used, pretty much in every organization with whom I worked. And what is the problem if it's that popular? Problem number one, you are mistaking having stereotypes with having discriminatory behaviors. Because studies have shown that across the board, both men and women, white and black, have pretty much the same type of stereotypes. There's this article called, Would Jesse Jackson Fail IAT? Because Jackie Jackson is a very outspoken anti-racist black person, so there's no way that she could fail it, right? In fact, she would. And here's why. It's simple. If you're a black child growing up in the United States, you probably would be educated on the potential racism that you will be facing as you grow up. So you will be educated on the exact same type of stereotype the society has on you. I myself have the exact same type of understanding of stereotypes of Asian people being shy, right? The reason is not because I am a shy person. It's simply because that is what the noise is all about around me. And that's something that I better know, so I know what kind of challenges I'll have to face, right? So that's the problem number one. Problem number two is that very often trainers using this test say that the goal for this training is to reduce prejudice. But most of the time, they only use the test to show you your blind spot. And there is no solution for such bias. And if you dig a little bit deeper, so far, in neuroscience at least, we haven't come up with any fundamentally feasible tool that we can rewire your brain to just chuck stereotypes, because it is humanly impossible. And as I mentioned before, it really does not even matter that much, because it's not the stereotypes that we have to eradicate. It's the uncivil discriminatory behaviors. And in fact, it's a vital tool for our survival to have stereotypes. In the sense, let's say, the first time you saw a car, you do not know what a car is, okay, or how fast and powerful a car can be when it hit you. So you get knocked over by it, okay, you lost your left leg. A month later, you got recovered from it. You went out and you see a car for a second time. Once again, you forgot what a car is, okay, you have not been able to stereotype it. So you lost your right leg. By the third time, if you still do not have the capacity to stereotype anything with four wheels and running very fast with a car, then there's a good chance that you won't survive. Okay, that's why it's so important for us to have stereotypes sometimes. All right, so it's all great to raise people's awareness of the existence of their stereotypes, but we have also knowledge that this is a human condition that we have to live with and despite of. This means that sometimes we have to really switch our focus, okay, on things that we can fix. So instead of looking for the psychological quick fix to change human brains, what we can do is spend time try to find ways to change, for instance, our operational process to minimize stereotype triggers, right? Or to figure out ways to foster more civil behaviors and accountabilities, okay? And in the same time, we can always wait for the miracle of hacking human brain to happen, all right? Now, third problem with this test is its reliability and validity. These are two fundamental parameters we look into for any psychometric test. Now, reliability means if I take this test for once, twice, 3 times, do I always have the same result? If not, it's not reliable because it's too much changing. Validity. If the test is really testing what it claims to be testing. Now, the problem with IAT is that once you start to get the hang of it, you are able to better your score. So to a certain degree, the test is really evaluating your familiarity instead of your true unconscious bias. To the degree that in 2015, even the very creators of the test said that there's just too much noise around the test. Okay. However, to this day, it is still the most widely used, or at least the opening test for many, way too many diversity trainings out there. Right? That being said, one has to be very vigilant about these things. I'll give you another example on why we have to be very vigorous in assessing the materials we have. Now, once there is a friend, a very good friend of mine, an HR professional as well, who have just read the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. It is a very well-written bestseller on racial issues in the United States. I think that was 2 years ago. Then she extensively quoted the book during this diversity workshop that she organized. At one point she said, well, this book is an eye-opener for me. And now I understand that capitalism is racist. Right. Up until that moment, I really wanted to read the book. And upon hearing the statement, I got the book immediately, right? Because I'm intrigued. That is such a bold statement, okay? So I read the entire book and did a good amount of due research based on what I've learned from it. And I cannot agree with the statement. Give you an example. During the segregation period, you have train operators saying that, well, we don't want segregation to continue because having segregated trains really costs too much, right? So capitalism, racist, that's a very hasty conclusion. Now, this is not a criticism of the book. I actually enjoy the book tremendously. But if you read into the rationale on how the author got to some of these statements, it's fairly easy to see that many parts of the book are more of sociology and philosophical essays instead of rigorously researched paper. There are lots of personal stories. They all serve very well for a piece of social comments, right, to raise people's awareness. But due to the lack of accuracy and scientific rigor, I personally will not use such statement for training purpose. Okay. Now, one last problem with scientific approach is the problem with data collection. Often you hear companies say, well, given the size of our company, we cannot be like Google, right? We can hire a team, the entire team called People Analytics, right? Which are composed of psychologists, data scientists, and HR experts, and they can just spend all their day collecting and studying the data about their HR practices. We don't have the resources. And also, we probably do not even have the sample size. Okay, that's true. That's very true. But you are not without solution. If you cannot come up with your own data set, ask yourself, have you at least read the industry report in your field? Have you read these things that were published by Google? Right? For instance, we're talking about Google. So let's talk about, for 1 second, the high-tech industry. If you are a small company in the Bay Area, you do not have the sample size, nor the resources to conduct your own researches. But a simple glimpse at the industry report will reveal some of the most shocking facts about this very industry. Now, in 2017, right, there was this industry report showed that in Bay Area, Asian women has the highest representative rate among the people of color in high tech, but also the least chance of having executive jobs. And the same phenomenon resides at a national level. Now, this report later was further illustrated, and there was another study done. So this other report is called The Illusion of Asian Success, and it showed that Asian white collars have the least chance to access high executive jobs in not only high tech, but almost all trades at the national level. Okay, so despite the stereotype, we might think that Asian people are well integrated in the high tech industry. Reality is telling you a different story. And if you're curious, the reason for this blind spot is actually very simple. Because the high rate of recruitment of Asian population in the high tech industry, this population is often not considered as underrepresented. Therefore, in many diversity initiatives, Asian population are simply not included. So yeah, that's it. So you might not be able to come up with this conclusion yourself if you are a small firm. But if you commit to stay informed of the industrial news, that paper could get into your hands and then into your minds. That's actually how it gets into my hand, right? Just by keeping yourself informed, keeping abreast with what is going on. Now, one final point I'd like to make around data is from this paper called Numbers Can Only Take Us So Far. It was written by Maxine Williams in 2017, so fairly new paper. Now, numbers can only take us so far in the sense that not only you have to have numbers, but you also have to be able to interpret them in a very, very careful way. Human beings are complicated. Numbers do not tell the whole pictures. Sometimes you really need to dig into individual cases instead of seeing the numbers. For instance, in a survey to evaluate the sense of happiness among the Latino employees, to which degree the average of your result is reliable. You might have 2 Latino employees, where one is light-colored from a well-off family, another one darker colored with a much more troubled background in terms of his economic background. Okay, so despite of the common ethnic background of these 2 people, the individual result can be dramatically different. And that's why sometimes you really need to dig into individual cases with qualitative studies and not just the quantitative side of the story. All right, so that is my second point. Having a scientific approach fostering our capacity to collect, interpret, and keeping up with data. Now, water. All right. Now, the third cause I want to address that accounts for the failure of many diversity programs is the lack of accountability on the part of the organization. Now, one of the common complaints that we often have as diversity consultants is that after the program or training, there's not always systematic commitment or audit of the result in the long term. And we always have this fear that some organizations would only initiate these programs as a symbolic gesture, because there are research papers showing that CORE tends to look for symbolic structure for diversity instead of their real advocacy. So in other words, organizations, they can absolutely use diversity management as pure window dressing, right? So how would you tackle this problem? Now, one of the most efficient methods is to engage advisory board or task force that are composed of people from both inside and outside of the organization. And these are people who hopefully will offer a more objective evaluation of the various practices, especially people from outside. It is used by both high-profile companies who have learned their lessons in the very hard way, like Coca-Cola, as well as small-sized company. So here I will share with you the story of how the idea of engaging people from outside to audit my own firm came into my mind. Now, the story happened because one day somebody asked me to evaluate his CV. And the person was trying to find a job in the United States, and he's European. So after reading his CV, my feedback was, you might want to sound a little bit more affirmative, confident in your language, right? So I threw in these very emotionally loaded words, say big fabulous words, that demonstrate a higher level of passion and confidence. And my interlocutor's response was, what you are doing here is very American. I can't say these things. It will make me sound as if I'm showing off. To which my counter argument is, well, you do want to sell yourself, right? So a couple of months later, another person asked me a similar favor. The same story happened again. I offered my version of the updated CV, and the person found that there's too much foam in my language, and it'll make him sound as if he's showing off. So that's when I started to ask myself, wait a second, is it possible that the notion of sounding confident with this high level of self-esteem is truly a culturally specific thing to the Americans? So I set myself off on this serious digging into the question. And here's what I found. As a nation, the United States attaches great importance to self-esteem because in 1980, there is a Canadian psychologist called Nathaniel Branden. He wrote a whole series of studies on self-esteem and the importance of it. And his work was later read by a Californian politician. This politician's understanding of self-esteem is a little bit different from that of the psychologist, but still, he loved so much of the writing of Nathaniel Branden and is so convinced by the importance of self-esteem that he commissioned the state of California to study self-esteem with a fat, generous budget. Of course, taxpayers paid for it, okay? And they published a very detailed and lengthy report on their findings. But also, they have distorted some of the findings. So you have this generation of Americans growing up in schools with this kind of, influence and this very deeply rooted idea of how important self-esteem is. And then they publish the findings and spread the idea to the entire world. But even to this day, there is still this debate on these publication of these findings. The argument is that people who have higher level of self-esteem, they often tend to give themselves better rating. Right? So the link between high esteem and better performance could be unfounded, at least not from the studies commissioned. So that was the story, and that was the day when I decided that I'm going to solicit people who are different from me, from outside of my firm, just to give my organization some fresh eyes. The thing is, we do have a very open culture inside the firm, right? We are open to different voices from within the team. but we are also so limited in the sense that most of us are from the same kind of background, school, or the books we read, the places we go for vacation, this and that. So it's just not possible to rely on ourselves if we want to be accountable. So I engaged my first advisory board to evaluate my very own business practices, and it paid off. I'll give you an example. For a long time, like many firms, during the recruitment interview, we ask our candidates this question: why do you choose us? And one day we had this young, fresh graduate. He replied to the question with, because I want to make my family proud of me. Now, my colleague, the interviewer, deemed that this answer showed a lack of motivation. And when this interview report was given to be examined by our advisor board, one of our advisors told us that in the country where this young man came from, it is very common to associate finding a good job with making one's family proud. And if anything, instead of lack of motivation, that's perhaps the strongest motivation for people out there, right? But also, based on which criteria could we conclude that the candidate's competence can be affected by this motivation? We have nothing, absolutely nothing. So we made a huge mistake, and we got the chance to understand it thanks to this external audit. And after this episode, we literally got rid of the question, why do you choose us? Because once we dig into studies in the field of management, as well as the recruitment result from within the firm, we found that there is no substantial evidence between the question and people's actual performance, right? So we got rid of the question. All right, so that is the first part. Second part I want to talk about around accountability is the way we handle damage control. Now, typically, if you commit a mistake, you offended somebody within your organization, make sure that the language you use is not, I'm sorry that you're offended, right? Make sure you say that, I'm sorry that I hurt you. No matter what your intention is, if the damage is done, the first step is always to acknowledge it, be that an organization or an individual. Now, another issue with damage control is that do not put the burden of education on the disadvantaged people. This is something I learned from Professor Dolly Chuck from her book I mentioned before, The Good Person You Meant to Be. All right, so after saying sorry, you can ask offended person to explain where you have made the mistake, the faux pas, but do not expect the full education. Take the education part rather on yourself. All right, in the book, the professor quoted a very interesting story. There is a fighter for diversity. She is the president of Working Mom Media. Her name is Saba Barry. And once she observed something really interesting. So she was watching the National Geographic, and she saw birds flying in the V shape, right? In the V formation, okay? And so from far away, you might have this impression that the birds are flying, but they are static because you are so far away. In reality, what happened is the lead bird, which means the bird that is on top of the V shape, the lead bird, is constantly rotating to the back and replaced by some other bird, right? And the reason it's simple is because as a lead bird, the bird often takes most of the headwind, so it gets exhausted very quickly. That's why they have to constantly rotate, okay? So the analogy is that people who are constantly in the forefront of diversity issues often has to shoulder a great amount of stress. Therefore, what we can do is we do not really need to overburden them with this constant weight of educating us on our own ignorance. If somebody is already suffering from prejudice, unless with that person's consent, let's just try to take the task of education on ourselves, right? That's not to say that you cannot ask, but we should definitely be considerate of the reality of our interlocutor, okay? So that is the third point on the problem of accountability. Now, the fourth and the last reason that accounts for the failure of many diversity programs, at least for me, is the lack of leadership support. I think this is perhaps the most frequent problem that I have in my professional life as a consultant. All right, diversity and inclusion within an organization should be a top-down decision and not bottom-up. I'm not saying that it cannot be bottom-up, but if you wait until it's a bottom-up movement, that's often when you already have a serious problem. So you want to have the support, the engagement, the devotion of your top management. And in reality, it's often not as rosy as one might wish. When you have a committed leader, everything runs smoothly. But if you don't, the music just stops. Let me give you some examples of what I heard during my encounters with some of these top executives. I actually have a whole list here, so I'm just going to quote the top number 4, right? Number 1, it's a former HRD of a multinational firm with its headquarters here in France. And he said, "While I'm not in a hurry to run into the diversity program, because I'm Italian and I managed to be the HRD of a French firm. So what kind of problem are we talking about here, right?" Number 2. Number 2 happened when I was discussing the issue of hiring people with physical difficulties with a HRD. Now, here in France, the state has certain regulation. So companies, they typically pay contribute, let's say a certain amount to contribute to a certain type of tax, unless they actively engage people with physical difficulties, then there is a reduction in this tax. So during my discussion with this HRD, he said, 100 times out of 100 times, I would prefer to write a check, simply because if not, I have to go out of my way to recruit people, and that is very, very time consuming, right? Okay, third example, really fun one, from a European manager. Okay, I think I heard it at least 4 or 5 times in my career. This is what he said: diversity is a big deal, but it's mainly an American problem, right? And the last one is my favorite, because that's one I heard the most often. All right, this is what the person said: "Yes, we are willing to give this diversity program a try, but it won't change much because the system is rigged." To which my response is, "You're right, the system is rigged, but you know what? We are the system." Organization is the biggest social fabric outside of one's immediate family surroundings. So to blame on the system is to cast away all the responsibilities and credits that we carry as one of the most important social components, right? So these are some of the examples that I carry in my repertoire of things said by executives. And if you go back to the case of Coca-Cola that I mentioned on the at onset of my lecture, a very shocking part of that story is that, in fact, if you look at the timeline of the story, the legal claim was made in 1999. But in reality, 4 years prior to that, Coca-Cola was well informed of its problems by one of its black-skinned senior VP. His name is Carwell. So in 1995, Carwell was sent to expand business operation in Africa. And he witnessed lots of complaints from Black workers on being treated unfairly. And after such troubling images and complaints, Carl wrote this very detailed reports, and he submitted it to his CEO. However, the report was not given any due attention. It was kept private. So in 1999, 5 years later, when the problem was in its white heat state, this report was made public. The then CEO, Daft, his name, who could have used the opportunity to address issues in the report, instead demoted Carl. And by now we all know what the story went later, how the story went later. It resulted in the most expensive corporate settlement in the history of the United States, right? So if your top leader cannot live up to the bar, for instance, if it's a person who would automatically associate any diversity endeavor with extreme left ideology, that's perhaps the first person you want to train, right? So you need to have leaders with a very profound understanding of history. You need to have leaders with a sense of justice and with a very deep understanding of difference. Okay, right. So these are the 4 points of why diversity management sometimes do not live up to its reputation. To sum it up, number 1, compliance-oriented mentality and outdated notion of diversity. Number 2, problem with being scientifically rigorous. Number 3, accountability issues. And the last one, lack of leadership commitment and support. Now, diversity management is definitely not a lie, but it is an ongoing venture where we have to relentlessly invent, revise, and evaluate our endeavors. And despite all the mistakes and limitations, I personally am very optimistic about the future. Why? Because as a professor, I have also been witnessing how these subjects around diversity, around corporate social responsibility has become a common component of our curriculum, be that at school or non-educational organizations. So yes, to borrow the words of Charles Dickens, it is the worst of times, it is the best of times. Worst of times, because more than ever before, we are exposed to our own limitation and we are running out of excuses. But also, best of our times, because more than ever before, we have this collective awareness of these limitations and excuses. And such awareness, if accompanied with intelligent effort, will eventually bring about the progress that is long due. At least that is what motivates me to keep on going, right? So this is the end of my lecture. Now, please feel free to share with me if you have any questions or comments.
So I have while I was listening to you, and thank you very much, because it was really very, very interesting and intense as well. And I'm glad you sum it up at the end, and I'm glad that we will be able to listen to it again, because there are so many points and it's very interesting. It reminded me of a tweet that the American actress Rosanna Arquette did. I don't know if you remember that. I should go back to you now. Do you remember when Rosanna Arquette did a tweet? It was in 2019, and she said, "I'm sorry I was born white and privileged. It disgusts me and I feel so much shame." Do you remember that? No?
It's the first time I heard about it, but it's very interesting.
So it was very surprising, and it started a lot of controversy, because it's as if to be inclusive, you had to deny what you are, which is very. I don't know how you feel about it, but I would be curious to know.
Yeah, I found her this very tweet is very interesting in the sense that it did demonstrate how this person has this mental gymnastics of turning the question around and putting herself in the shoes of shouldering all these responsibilities and historical residue that was not really of her own making. I do not really think that the idea is to shame people and to make it a new religion, because that is often the claim that we have. So whatever you are saying has to be politicized, has to be brought into the holy grail of controversy. I think the idea of this person publishing a tweet like this is mainly to raise people's awareness of just basically be very sensible to the reality, to be reminded of the fact that we all carry with us these historical residue, even if it's not of my own making. They're still having repercussion in every second that we're living in this world, in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you. And what do you think? Do you think we should be promoting racial colorblindness within the organization? Is it for you a good way to promote diversity?
All right, racial color blindness, right? Is that what the question is about?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Now, racial color blindness. Very interesting question. Okay. So first, let's just explain the concept a little bit. Now, the idea of racial color blindness is to say that given that we're trying to promote diversity, let's just bypass the idea of color altogether, right? Mm-hmm. So it does have its root in reality in the sense that you do have this, this, especially among the millennial generation, the Gen Z, there are more and more people saying that each person has so many different colors within us. Me, myself, I definitely do not want people to associate me with uniquely chopsticks, for instance, right? So the idea sounds beautiful. And if I'm an idealist, I'd love to believe in it, just like I'd love to believe in marriage. But as a practitioner in HR management, and as a person who has failed her marriage, I have to say that racial color blindness, it does not really always work. There are many reasons behind it, but the most important one, I would say that is because we do not have an equal footing to start with. So by saying that I don't see color, I only see you for who you are, that sentence is very problematic, because in that only see you as who you are, in that who you are, you might already be the victim of, let's say, systemic oppression, unequal access to education, inequality in paycheck, all these things. So if you stick to colorblindness and you only see the person without all these residue, without all these burdens behind the person, you're basically brushing off the problem itself. And if you want to desensitize people, it can be very dangerous, as you can imagine. So racial colorblindness, the problems are controversy around it and its efficacy. They're all very well documented. There are lots of research papers around this. And based on all these field study, it just do not really work as the promise. Maybe one day it will work, right? Maybe one day we will all be very enlightened. The historical residue is disappears, and we can all get rid of our embedded bias. But before the arrival of that day, I just do not see how this argument is really working in workforce. Not for the moment, at least. Yeah. Hopefully
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Another question, do you think, because you came to France and you were living in the US before, do you think there is a difference between diversity management between France and Europe more mainly and the US?
Oh yeah, definitely. There are many differences. For instance, there is the historical difference. There is the legislative difference. Well, you often have people saying that, well, it seems like in the United States you have more laws than here in Europe about racial discrimination. There's many reasons behind that. So in the US, we have this legal system of federal and state courts. And we also have a different legal system in the sense that in US, we have the common law. So we attach great importance to precedents. That's how we interpret each case. Whereas here in Europe, the main legal system is the civil law system. Okay, so everything is pre-coded. So given the difference in the interpretation, we orchestrate things in very different ways. And also there is, say, culture difference. So for instance, in Europe, we have very different interpretation of sexual harassment. up until recent years, right? And in the United States, is often on top of the HR's agenda. So have demographic difference. The United States is immigrant country, and that's not the case for not all, but a certain part of European countries. But I will also say that even within Europe, you do not always have, we do not really have this homogeneous idea of European diversity management. For instance, Scandinavian, they have very different way of handling gender equity compared with here in France. For another example, the state of France has a very particular rule about data collecting, in the sense that in France, it is banned to collect data on your employee or students' ethnic background, religious belief. The reason being that during the Second World War, the Jewish population were asked to have the self-identification, which ended in a really sad story, as we all know. So yeah, each country has its very specific way of going about these things. So I would say yes, there are lots of difference, but not just between the United States and Europe. The difference also exists within Europe. Yeah.
And I suppose you've seen that in France recently, there was a new law to promote women in the boards of companies, of big companies, with quotas. So you spoke about it earlier, but what, as a woman, how do you feel about this? That there is a need for quotas to have more women on the board of and executive teams.
Can you repeat the first part of the question? Women were promoted to what? I did not really catch that part.
To the executive board of big companies.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to do quotas in France to promote women, so that I think big companies have to have 30% of women on their boards.
Yes.
How do you feel about that?
I think that is so much long due. It's just so much long due, in the sense that for a long time, women were discouraged and misunderstood, in the sense that in this popular belief, we always have this association between women and these family related tasks. Therefore, it's for our own very good, for our be that mental or economic comfort, to shoulder this role that were imposed on us. And recently I have read this very interesting paper, which showed that actually both men and women, we have the exact same type of vision about family. And it's just the way we go about our family obligation are quite different. So what happened is, traditionally, we always thought that women cannot shoulder these leadership positions because we would take time off with our kids. And what the research has found is actually men do exactly the same thing. It's just instead of actively taking days off, men would cheat on their working hours. They would sneakily reduce the traveling hours or the working hours to just, to be at least taking this time off to be with the families. And so all these traditional beliefs we had are often very, very unfounded. Another research was this belief that women do not have the leadership quality because we cannot take risks. We do not have enough appetite for risks. And what results have found is they studied this group of investment, investment bankers, just to see if it's true that women are risk averted by nature and therefore not able to shoulder leadership position. And what they turn out is that women and men, they have exactly the same type for appetite for risk. What really makes difference is the access for information. So typically as a woman, you are not really invited to certain network opportunities as compared with men. Therefore, your access information is so limited that it would hinder you from taking certain risks, so to speak, right? So I have this impression that we have more and more from the scientific world information to debunk these predominant and false beliefs, and I think for that reason alone, it's long due for give back women these positions that we deserve. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Xiaoyu Li. We were delighted to have you with us tonight. Thank you for sharing your experience. It was really interesting, and I am happy to say that this conference will be on the Schiller YouTube channel for people to take time to listen to it again.